Hi, everyone. Okay, so welcome. It's so nice to have you all here. And it's so fun to scroll through the chat and see everyone's faces. Um, so miss organizing with you all in person. So this is a series hosted by Jewish Voice for Peace, New York City, called Conversations with Movement Elders. JVP New York City is a chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, a national grassroots organization made up of 20,000 members who work for freedom, justice, and dignity for all people from here to Palestine. My name is Gaby Spear. I've been a member of Jewish Voice for Peace since 2015. And I'm so excited to be having a conversation today with Sherry Gorelick. Before we begin that conversation, just a few notes about how, if you are kind of new to JVP or are interested in getting plugged in, your schedule has suddenly opened up in the middle of this pandemic. If you want to get more involved with Jewish Voice for Peace in other ways besides this series, you can email newyork@jewishvoiceforpeace.org. And you can become more involved. We are working with the Free Them All campaign to free all incarcerated people. And the other thing is I just want to note that Una is giving us some more information in the group chat. So if you also want to keep up with that, we're kind of taking notes there. So I wanted to kind of intro this conversation by saying that I distinctly remember a few years ago at a JVP meeting, we did an icebreaker where we were asked to name an elder in our family or circle of friends who guides our social justice work. And I remember feeling a bit embarrassed because I couldn't think of an elder in my life like that. But I ended up saying that I feel lucky to be surrounded by an older generation of mentors who model that for me now. And I feel that this series is really the deep dive version of that icebreaker. What can elders in our movement teach us about the long fight ahead? The Palestinian novelist and poet Hala El-Yan recently wrote an article where she says, "I want to line up my ancestors. I want to know how they survived." And I feel that is very similar for the elders I'm in community with here in JVP. I want to line up my elders and I want to know how they survived. So I feel honored to interview my very first friend in JVP, Sherry Gorelick. I sat next to Sherry at JVP Seder back in 2015. Sherry is going to be speaking with us today about women in the struggle for justice in Palestine. Hi, Sherry.
Hello, hello. It's wonderful to see everybody. It's a joy. It's a joy.
So Sherry, I want to start off by talking about your involvement in the organization Women in Black, which for everyone who doesn't know, it's a women's anti-war movement founded by Israeli women in 1988 after the outbreak of the first Intifada. So can you go ahead and talk about your involvement in it and how it began?
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I want to talk first about how it began. In the first Intifada, Yitzhak Rabin, who was defense minister at the time, went on TV. This is just stuff I've heard, that I didn't experience, obviously, because I was here, and articulated a policy of, quote, force, might, the breaking of bones. And he meant the breaking of the bones of the children who were throwing rocks at the soldiers. So a group of Israeli women dressed in black and held a demonstration holding up signs saying, stop the violence, negotiate, stop the occupation. I don't know how well you can see this. but this is a photograph that I took in 1989 in Haifa. And then they came back the next Friday, and the next Friday. It spread throughout Israel. It spread throughout the world. There were women in black vigils in 150 different countries. The Intifada was December 9th, 1987, and Women in Black formed a few weeks after that. And in recognition of that, some organizations formed, like Irina Klepfish and Claire Kinberg formed the Jewish Women's Committee Against the Occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And we used to receive speakers, first Israeli Jewish speakers, and then accompanied by Israeli-Palestinian speakers, and then Palestinian women from the West Bank. And that really opened up a lot of people's eyes. I want to talk about the development toward the conference, but there's much more to say about Women in Black. Not many vigils still stand. There is an international Women in Black listserv, and people are in communication with each other. They have annual conferences. The movement that in which each women in black is autonomous, so we set our own policies. And we have had 3 Women in Black vigils in New York City alone. And the one that we have now at Union Square formed in 2001. So the Intifada was in December 87. Women in Black formed in January 1988. And it happened that an American Jewish organization was setting up a conference on the empowerment of Jewish women to take place in Jerusalem. And so some of the members of Women in Black went to that conference, wanted to raise the question of the occupation, and were rebuffed. So they had a post-conference, and they invited 2 Palestinian women from the West Bank. And it was the first time that some Israeli women actually met Palestinian women. It was the first time that international women at this conference met the Israeli women who were demonstrating against the occupation and the Palestinian women. And it had a big impact. They started to organize for another conference, and they did in 1990. And the Israeli women worked on the morning program, the Palestinian women worked on the afternoon program. There was increased communication between the two. And then in 1990, they were planning together a conference, discussing together what the program would be, what the demands would be. And I was lucky enough to be invited by Dalia Sachs, who I see is on call, to Haifa, and to sit in on one of the meetings of the Israeli women. There were 4 Palestinian women's organizations associated with different branches of the PLO. And So they would have a joint meeting. I was able to be at a joint meeting. We sat in a circle in 70s feminist style. It's only afterwards that I realized that I was sitting in a room with people who were supposed to be enemies. And one of the slogans they came up with was, "We refuse to be enemies." So they were planning this conference, and they had to plan it to be both within Israel and outside of it, because at the time it was illegal for Israelis to meet with any members of the PLO. It was illegal for the PLO to be within Israel. There were Israelis who were in jail for having met with the PLO. And it was also illegal to even use the colors of the Palestinian flag in a still life painting. So they had to hold, and they wanted high level people at this conference and grassroots level. So
Wait,
what?
can you say more about the painting? Can you repeat that? It just surprised me.
Illegal to use the colors of the Palestinian flag for any, public purpose, I gather. So if you made still life, you couldn't do stuff. Okay. Anyway, so they were planning to have a grassroots component and one of high level people outside of the territory in Geneva. And they were focusing on three elements: women's participation in peace talks, women's perspectives about how to handle conflict without violence, and women's interests and issues. Because one of the things that they brought forth was the relationship between the occupation and domestic violence, so that soldiers would come back from, I won't use the word service, from participation in the occupation and come back home and bring the violence back home. So they wanted to raise many issues, that's not the only one, of the way in which the situation of constant war and conflict is borne very heavily on women, and it's not usually discussed in the context of the conflict or of peace. So those were three elements of what they wanted to focus on. The Gulf War intervened, so they had a much smaller local conference. And then they had a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, which I had the wonderful opportunity of going to because I was sponsored by an organization called New Jewish Agenda and an organization that started in France, and we had a branch in New York called the International Jewish Peace Union. So they sent me over, and I went to this conference in Geneva in May, where there were 75 women from 13 different countries, chaired by the PLO ambassador to the Netherlands. And they met for 2 days, had workshops, had discussion of the major issues: land rights, water rights, settlements. They came up with a 3-page document of a final document, which was quite remarkable. They were raising the issue of settlements. They were raising the issue of ending military aid. It was quite remarkable. Now, the final document had to be a consensus document. so that anything that anyone objected to would not go into the document. And what's significant about this, besides the stuff that was in it about immigration, all sorts of issues, the right of return, um, return, was that there was an Israeli woman who had grown up in South Africa and was part of Women in Black, I believe. And she mentioned a number of people suggested a policy of boycott and divestment and sanctions, DDS. This is May 1991, long before the 2005 declaration of the DDS. And there was a whole debate about it. And the woman who had grown up in South Africa said, you have to put pressure on. That's the only thing that worked with South Africa. You know, apartheid in South Africa started to end in 1990. And this is 91. Other Israelis said, don't don't pressure Israel in this way. Don't boycott, because it will antagonize and frighten Israelis, and it will move Israel to the right. So they didn't come out with support for boycott in 91. And now Israel has its most right-wing government ever. So much has changed. So much has changed since those years. And one of the things that changed, and I have to explain this before telling you what they came out with, is the two-state solution. Because in the 70s and the 80s, being in favor of a Palestinian state side by side with Israel as a Jewish state was a progressive position at that time. It was a progressive position because people were not recognizing the humanity of Palestinians at all. There was one state, Israel. And so to be in favor of a Palestinian state was a left-wing, radical, progressive position. That has been changed enormously because of the tremendous expansion of the settlements, so that there is no territory for the Palestinian state. So it has been changed, and it has, its meaning now is basically as an excuse for doing nothing except letting the situation get worse. But that's not what was its meaning then. And I want to emphasize that that's not what was its meaning then. Because in that final statement of the Geneva Conference, which I can't find right now. Oh yeah, here it is. They said that they were in favor of a two-state solution. It said, women share a vision of freedom and equality, which is born out of our common struggle against discrimination, oppression, and subjugation of any type, be it on the basis of gender, religion, or nationality. We, Palestinian, Israeli, and international women, declare our commitment to a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of UN Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338, Territories for Peace, two states, Israel and Palestine, coexisting peacefully within secure and recognized borders. And then they came out with special negotiations. And they talked about the impact of the demographic changes on the conflict, the economic and social consequences of occupation, yet human rights or the destruction of human rights, and that the occupation is in fact a danger to everyone, and they supported negotiation. Now, this conference.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll just say one more thing about it. This conference took place at a time when Secretary of State Baker was traveling back and forth trying to create an international conference between Israel and the PLO. Unsuccessful. They had not been able to do it. And as I went back by plane to New York from Geneva, I opened the International Herald Tribune, and there was no notion, of course, no report, of course, about the Geneva Women's Conference. And there was just the continued failure of being able to get Israel and Palestine together. Well, finally, in
one moment. I think the Wi-Fi is being a little strange, and so I just like wanted to take a second to make sure we get that. It sounded a little weird. Can you say something and see if it is still doing that?
I'm saying something.
Is that better for everyone?
Hello, can you hear me? It says the sound is very low. Is it anything that I'm doing?
I think it got better. Okay, I'm gonna let you keep going, and then I'm gonna ask you another question.
Okay, so finally, 2 years later, there was a conference for Israeli-Palestinian peace in Madrid. And Simona Sharoni, in her book, Gender and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, shows a picture of the Israeli contingent and the Palestinian contingent. You notice anything missing?
Women.
Exactly. It's hard to tell the difference between the two contingents. I have to look at the caption, in fact, to figure out which is the Israeli negotiating team, which is the Palestinian negotiating team. But it was all men. So their demand for women's participation was not answered, and it's a long struggle.
Oh, so Sherry, I think the sound's getting a little weird. Would you want to try and call in? It's possible also that the papers that you're lifting up and down might be with a weird crinkly work. Oh, it's okay. I mean, tech is weird. This is all very strange. I'm gonna ask you a question and see what how you sound, and then we can kind of proceed from there. So I want to know about how are you the person that you are? Tell us a little bit about your childhood, your upbringing, your parents. How did it influence you and your interests in all of the stuff that you just talked about?
Okay, I'm going to be shuffling papers one more time, so I apologize, and then hopefully I will find what I need and not wiggle around anymore. Okay, I'm the daughter of a Jewish immigrant working class. And my mother was Orthodox, as we would have said, not Meshugana. She didn't wear a sheitel, but she observed the Sabbath and all the holidays, and we had 4 sets of dishes. My father was a communist atheist And as devoted to his atheism as my mother was to her Orthodox religion. And it was remarkable, actually.
Sherry, I'm so sorry. I just want to make sure before you tell your amazing stories that the sound is gonna work for people. So you might have to call in. Let's do this. So you were beginning to talk to us about your upbringing.
Yes. So I was saying that my parents had very different politics and different relationship to religion. And it's only in being an elder to myself, I guess, that I realized in looking back that it was remarkable how they managed to have these discussions with respect. We would start breakfast on Sunday, and then my mother would take the dishes off and wash them and put lunch on. We would talk all day Sunday, just the three of us. And I do not remember them shouting at each other. I don't remember any kind of hostility. And they discussed their different viewpoints. I don't think they convinced each other, but we talked about it all day long. And it's only recently that I thought that that's quite a model of how to deal with difference. I'm not sure it's a model that I could live up to. And one thing that I got from them is the sense that I'm part of the world and that what happens in the rest of the world matters. They were both profoundly political and turned me into a news junkie. And even though they had different politics, they both had a sense that what happens in the world is important to us and that we're related to the rest of the world. So now in my social isolation, except for the wonderful contact with my two aides, I don't feel isolated because I have you and I have my daughter and I have my friends and I have the world. I am related to what happens in the world. And I think that was a great gift that they gave to me. My father, as I said, he was a sheet metal worker, construction worker, and he was a communist. So I grew up absolutely knowing that the bosses were against us and we were against the bosses. And that has really given me a wonderful foundation for living in the world. So it made me less susceptible. I never had this romantic notion that all Jews are together. It made me less susceptible when the Jewish establishment spoke for us, presumably, as Jews, and when Israel was saying that their cruelty to Palestinians was on my behalf. I knew it wasn't. I described how awful the German Jewish bourgeoisie was to the entering Eastern European immigrants at the turn of the 19th century. So I think that's been a strength. I remember my father leaning over and turning to me. I was 9 years old. And he said in his accented English, "Sherry, do you actually believe in a supreme being?" I don't remember what I answered. I was still identifying more with my mother, but that was part of that was just part of growing up. And it also gave me my career, because I entered sociology to try to figure out how and why Jews define their Jewishness differently. And after 60 years of looking, I don't have an answer, but at least it was a good question to pursue, and I'm still interested in it.
Oh my goodness, Sherry, that answer, all of that was so beautiful. Okay, let's keep going. I kind of going off of that, talk a little bit about kind of the historical events that radicalized you, the moments that kind of changed you and began to shift things for you and got you to Women in Black and JVP.
Well, as I said, identified more with my mother, although I was very much gradually rejecting religion. And then, I forgot to say this to you, Gaby, when we talked. When I was 14, The Diary of Anne Frank was published, and there was a play on Broadway, and there was a movie. And she was 14 and I was 14. And the Holocaust hadn't been discussed in my family, I think. And I thought, if there's a God, either he's evil because he's allowing these things to happen, or he's powerless, so there's no point in praying to him. And I spoke to my mother at some point, and I said that. And she said, well, we got Israel out of it. I said, getting Israel was worth the killing of 6 million Jews? And she said, no, no, no. And then I don't know what she followed up with it. But that knowledge definitely cemented my leaving of the religion and did not turn me into a Zionist. Israel in my childhood was assumed, it wasn't the kind of fevered Zionism that exists now among some people. Israel was assumed. Somebody came to the house with a little metal box for us to put coins in for orphanages in Israel. But it wasn't a big deal. And in fact, it's only after years of being in the Palestinian, struggle and the struggle about Palestine that I started to think, where was I in 1948? I was 8 years old when the state was established. I don't remember anything about it. I don't remember any kind of celebration, anybody being happy, anything about it. So it was extremely low key. We didn't know anything about Palestinians, but it was extremely low key and therefore not an important part of my identity. One of the things I was remembering is that when I was at Queens College, the Sharpeville massacre happened in South Africa, and a man named Allard Lowenstein brought to the campus a man named Hans Bucas, who was a South African Black man. 6'4", he had smuggled him out of South Africa in the trunk of a Volkswagen, and that made a big impression on me. So the issue of South Africa was important. Racism was important. We were very interested in combating racism. I was in high school when the Supreme Court was debating the 1954 desegregation ruling, and when we won that one, and we were very happy about that happening. So, but I was very late in coming to feminism. What I cared about was what was happening to Black people and class issues. So when, and this is the 70s, that's the heart of the women's movement. And when my friends, especially Lourdes Benaria, who was my neighbor and colleague at Livingston College, said, well, why don't you come and join us in MF2, that's Marxist Feminist 2. There were 5 Marxist feminist groups in New York. I believe that Roz was in MF1. And I said, no, this is not what gets me enraged. But then I eventually went to an MF2 meeting. And that's one of the things that changed my life, because it was the personal and the political. In '68, I was a full-time research assistant and a part-time graduate student at Columbia when some students took over Hamilton Hall at Columbia and started a sit-in that lasted for an entire week. And at first I said I wouldn't do it, and then I wound up being in Fairweather Hall. Those of you who live in Brooklyn probably know Rusty Eisenberg. She was a history graduate student at the time, and we had all those informative discussions because we had to decide whether to accept leaving, but without amnesty. So there were all these discussions about the Russian Revolution and what did amnesty. It was a real education that week, and it really changed me, and it radicalized me. And after that, I wound up studying Marx with a couple of Guyanese and a Polish woman. I'm very lucky that I happened to be there at that time, and it really made its mark on me. But I would go and march against the war. The Vietnam War was, very important. And I would go on a march, and people would be chanting and supporting the Vietnamese, and then they would chant for the PLO, and I couldn't do it. And I thought, I have to figure out why I can't do this. So I tried to create a study group of Jews who would learn about Israel. We didn't say Israel and Palestine in those days. I couldn't get people interested, but I got acquainted with Beverly Elkin, who was to become my lifelong friend. And when we met, she had just had an argument with her cousins about Israel. I had just had an argument with my cousins about Israel. So we figured we ought to learn some things. And we started doing some reading. And that's what started that part of it. 1967 was a very important turning point, not so much for me, but it was an important turning point in the struggle and in the U.S. 67, Israel's winning that war convinced the U.S. ruling class that they had a tiger over there that they could associate with. So it committed the United States to Israel much more than it had been before. 67 created the occupation, and therefore there were all these people who were then demonstrating against the occupation, by which they meant, and we meant, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. And it took until much, much later for us to realize that the occupation started in 48. Can you hear me? Okay, that the occupation started in 48, but that took a long, long time to get to that point.
Do you want to talk about 1982 as a big turning point?
I do. I absolutely do. 1982 changed my life too. Israel invaded Lebanon, and it was on television. And we saw on television the Israeli soldiers painting white X's on the backs of the Palestinian refugees in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. And then the Phalange, the right-wing Lebanese, came in and massacred people. And when I saw them painting those white X's, I thought, that's just like the yellow star that the Jews had to wear in Europe. And then we would get these reports of how long the people in the camps could hold out. They didn't have food. I thought, that's like the Warsaw Ghetto. I had just read The Wall by John Hersey that Dorothy mentioned in her interview. And from that moment on, I identified with Palestinians as a Jew. And ever since, I have identified with Palestinians as a Jew. Syria came in and attacked the Palestinians. And the Arab countries were silent. And I thought, it's just like World War II. The world doesn't care. And it had an enormous impact on me. In fact, it shaped the rest of my political life and most of the rest of my scholarly life.
Well, so you've kind of already been talking about this, but so you've talked about what influenced you, but who were the big influences on you? Who were the people bringing you to the protests?
Well, not to that protest, but in in '82, I joined a group called Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon, and we were it's obvious what it was for. At some point, I don't even remember what point this was, Rabab Abdul Hadi gave a whole course at the Marxist School on Palestinian. And we used this book. I don't know whether you can see it, and of course you can't read it backwards, but it's called Our Roots and School Lives. And for Jewish leftists like most of us, we didn't know any of that stuff. And Rabab has been an amazing mentor to me. Not to me, to me. That course opened up so much. And all these years, she is such a mensch. She's such a deep thinker and politically very, very strong and humane and informative. So I have been very, very lucky to live in a world that has Rabab in it. And so she was a very important person in that. And then when in 82, when I suddenly realized that I had written a book about City College that excluded women for its first 102 years, I thought, gee, I better look into this feminism stuff. And I went to a Great Lakes College's something or other on the feminist transformation of the curriculum in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And it was absolutely wonderful. We had substantive classes in the morning. We had pedagogical classes in the afternoon. We had films, and I found out about the National Women's Studies Association, which I went to the following year, and every year since that, up until last year, I only missed 3. One for my daughter's high school graduation, and one when I was in Israel and Palestine. And at NWSA in 1986, where I went it was in Ohio, I was pushing my stroller with my then 8-month-old baby. I met Dahlia Sachs. And Dahlia has been another wonderful person that I have learned so much from. NWSA had a Jewish caucus, which always was split about Israel, very strongly split about Israel. But I just, while going through these papers that are now in disorder on my desk, I came across a resolution that we passed at NWSA about opposition to Israeli attacks on Palestinians. So Dahlia and I were part of engaging with the Jewish caucus of NWSA. And it happened that Dahlia was a grad student at NYU. So we happened by accident to fly back together on the same plane, and we became friends. And when Dahlia went back to Israel, she and the Intifada happened in Women in Black form. She was one of the women inaugurating Women in Black in Haifa, and I came to visit. So I learned so much from her and them. And one of the things that she has done, this was in 2005. Let me back up a little bit. One of the things that the women's peace movement did was question military solutions and violent solutions to differences. So there was an annual conference on security that was, defined and made up of just the military, and the women had a conference on alternate conceptions of security, different ways. And Dahlia and her graduate students did a study of different women, Jewish Israeli women, Palestinian citizens of Israel. What was the continuation of the armed conflict doing to women? And they came out with this wonderful study. It was an interview study, and the ways in which women dealt with the vulnerability, and also had to deal with the husbands who came back from participating in the occupation, and how to deal with children. And one of the really interesting things in one of their, I have to stop for a minute. One of the other ways in which they were opposing militarism was that they came up with a women's security index, trying to measure what are the things that make women insecure? Because security tends to be defined only in militaristic ways. So they came up with an annual Women's Security Index. Now, in 2000, there was the second intifada because, well, I shouldn't get into too much detail. So that was the short period in which there were suicide bombings. So there were Israelis getting killed in these suicide bombings. And of course, the military response you can figure out. And the study that Dalia and her students and associates did came up with that for Palestinian citizens of Israel, they were doubly vulnerable because they could be the victims of a suicide bomb. And also, they were attacked by Jewish Israelis because they were Palestinian. And there was a lovely poem, a statement, but I'm not going to shuffle the papers about it. But what it is an effort to examine exactly what military conflict is and how it makes people insecure and how your own military makes you insecure. And that is, we'll talk about this later, but that is one of the things that I want to discuss as some way that we can go forward in our own work.
Okay, so what we're gonna do next is we're definitely gonna talk about that kind of last question about like, what do you think this means for our work today? But I think this would be a good time to plug the organization that Sherry has invited us to fundraise for based on kind of her interests and her work and what we've talked about today. So this organization is called New Profile, and it's an Israeli feminist organization which encourages conscientious objection to the Israeli military and fights against the militarization of Israeli society. And you're gonna see a link to that drop in the chat. And you'll have the chance to donate to that organization. Sherry, do you want to say anything about it as a plug, or was that a good plug?
I think people, yes, it was a good plug. I think people should just go to the website because I think it's a fascinating organization and a fascinating website. And one of the things that that just caught my eye, I didn't read the whole thing, was that in school books, children learn how to count by counting tanks, military tanks. You know, it's very key. You know, when we were talking about women's perspectives on the conflict, it's very key to be looking at how militarization just seeps into all of society. Camouflage is a fashion statement. You see little children wearing basically military uniforms, little 2- and 3-year-olds, and I feel like going up to their mothers and saying, "You're creating cannon fodder." Women wear handbags with camouflage. That's here. But this was really an earlier effort in Israel to look at that, look at the way in which military thinking and actually military language here in the United States just so permeates the way we think and what we do that we don't even notice. notice it. And I think that what No Profile has been doing is just so key to having that realization and fighting against that military conception of how to solve problems.
Right. So with that, let us make some pledges in the chat. If people feel comfortable putting how much they'd be down to donate to this organization, and you can drop that information in the chat. Or if you don't feel like it, that's okay too, and you can donate privately as well, but it would be nice to kind of encourage us to get this going. And then I want to continue with kind of the last question I'm going to ask Sherry before we open it up to questions I see popping up in the chat. So Sherry, what does all this work mean for our work today? What is kind of what you've been talking about mean for the long fight ahead?
Okay, I'm going to answer that in a minute, but I just wanted to mention that one of the things that the Israeli women's peace movement, in coordination with our organizations here, like the Jewish Women's Committee and the Occupation, did was work on Palestinian women prisoners. And since JVP puts a lot of emphasis on prisoners, I thought you might be interested in the fact that this is before computers, it's before email, it's before texting, but we created there and here something called the Women's Organization for Women Political Prisoners, and they would select a prisoner, a woman prisoner's case, and send us the information, and then we would send telegrams to the heads of the prison on behalf of the women prisoners. And in some cases, women prisoners who were ill were released as a result of the joint campaign of Israeli women and US women. So I thought I wanted to mention that because I know that people make a big, understand the importance of work with prisoners. But that was not what I wanted to say. We have the Deadly Exchange program. And I think we ought to find some way of adding to it in a more general feminist perspective about militarism. Gwynne Kirk and Margot Okazawa-Ray had a teach-in, an international teach-in recently, and I will send a link to that, about militarism and feminism. I'm not saying it right, but and COVID. And they had people participating in this panel from the Philippines, from South Korea, from Palestine, talking about the bases, the US bases all over the place, but talking about militarism from a feminist point of view and opposing militarism from a feminist point of view. Now, we are against US military aid to Israel. Women in Black Union Square is against military aid to Israel. And I think we ought to be going further in talking about what militarism means here and in Palestine, and what it means for women here and all over the world.
Sherry, do you want to add anything else before I kind of begin seeing if there's more questions in the chat?
Well, I had a wonderful quote on one of these pieces of paper. If I find it, I'll use it, but maybe we should go to the questions first. Thank you.
Okay. So, well, I guess this is kind of, Esther had a question about kind of what are things that you struggle with today, but I think that was kind of answered. There's a question about what did you tell us more about what you studied at Queens College and your scholarship there. What did you study at Queens College?
I studied anthropology, sociology, which was a joint department until they split apart. But that's what I studied. And then sociology was really not as interesting as anthropology. Somebody called it the painful elaboration of the obvious, but I'm a total coward about everything, and I was scared to go off to Africa, which is where anthropology was happening, I thought. And at that, so I switched to looking at people in the United States.
Can I ask the question that I have been interested in, but I didn't know if we would have time for?
You're the boss.
I'm not the boss, you're the boss. Okay, so so you were diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, MS, in 1996, I believe. 1996. Yep. How did having a disability late in life shift your understanding of feminism and justice and work for Palestine?
Well, I have to say that my disability, I had the kind of MS that progresses very slowly. So I was diagnosed in '96, but nobody could tell but me that there was anything wrong with me. But now I have severe mobility problems, as those who know me know. In terms of Israel and Palestine, what struck me is that Israel manufactures disability. I mean, looking at the snipers shooting at the legs of young men mostly in the Great March of Return, they're shooting at their legs, and they're proud of their precision. And I thought, they are manufacturing disability. I was lucky in that I didn't really get MS, or at least, start to manifest it until I was in my 50s. But young people are disabled, and Israel is disabling people. And I think that's so disgusting. I also came very late to an awareness of the need for accommodations, a need for even addressing the question of disability. And again, because I came late to it, I benefit tremendously from disabled activists like Nadina Laspina, like Simi Linton, who have made life so much more possible for me than it would have been by fighting for ramps on the buses and curb cuts on the sidewalk and stuff like that. And it's hard to keep that front and center because I was totally oblivious to it until it affected me. But I think it's really important, especially since there are very progressive people, disabled people, who fight for the things that we fight for, and who we need to learn from. Nadina has participated in the Union Square Women in Black in the past. And she has a wonderful book out, a memoir called Such a Pretty Girl. You should check it out because it's a wonderful memoir.
Yeah, I just want to repeat, I mean, both Elena and I put it in the chat, but you said Israel
Wait, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Okay.
Speak again, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of echo what you said, and that you're talking about Israel manufacturing disability, and this idea that, like, you kind of talked about this already, that like the history of racism was at the forefront of your mind for a while, and classism, and then you kind of were a latecomer to feminism. And I think I would say for many of us, ableism is kind of one of the last isms that we kind of seek to discuss and undo in our communities. And I kind of remember that as like a pivotal moment for us in JVP New York as well. Oh, so we have a couple more questions. So give me 1 second. Can you talk a little bit about, a little bit more about kind of your scholarship, or do you feel like you've talked enough about that at Rutgers?
Well, actually, I do want to talk about that because it has to do with the women's movement, indirectly. In 1982, among the many things that happened in 1982, Letty Cotton Pogrebin published an article in Ms. Magazine called Anti-Semitism in the Women's Movement. And it was about the Copenhagen, the UN conferences on the status of women. And among the examples of anti-Semitism were support for Palestine, Palestinians. And it had an enormous impact. Everybody, whether they hated it or loved it, everybody knew about it. And also, I was at the point of having finished my book. I was ready to do something else and ready to have something about women in the something else. And I wound up traveling to Canada, where there was a controversy at an International Women's Day event. A Palestinian woman spoke, and a Jewish woman got up and protested. This is sort of a quote: "the introduction of the Middle East into this feminist event." She was booed by the audience, and it split the feminist movement, which was quite large and quite strong. So I interviewed one woman, and then she recommended somebody else that had been that had been her friend and took an opposite position. And I wound up interviewing 16 women and doing oral histories because I've always been interested in the process by which people become who they become. I mean, we're always becoming until we die, but hopefully becoming. So I did oral histories about how they grew up in Jewish households and what was their experience with anti-Semitism, how did they define anti-Semitism. It was fascinating to me. I always love hearing about people's lives. So I worked on a book on Jewish feminists' relationship to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I have never finished. So I have a lot of manuscripts of chapters that are languishing in my file cabinet for something like 30 years. And I don't think this is a birth that's going to happen. But that's what I was concerned with. I was concerned, really the same question as with my parents. What makes people come to whatever conclusions they come to and whatever kind of identities they come to and what kind of politics they come to and how that interacts with the history that they live through, the specific kind of history that they live through.
So I want to pop in and say just an update that we've raised 260 so far in pledges. And a kind of possibly a final question coming from Esther is, given the struggles going on now and the state of the movement now, what does Sherry struggle with?
Well, you know, I wanted to say about how things have changed. I keep thinking of the only line I remember from A Tale of Two Cities, which we were required to read in high school. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. The situation in Palestine and Israel is awful and has deteriorated tremendously over the 40 years that I have been focused on it. That's the worst of times. And we have a fascist in the United States. In a way, the best of times, I guess, is what has happened to the movement in itself. When we had Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon, and then there were other, because 1982 really, you know, troubled Jews and they needed to look at things that they didn't look at before, we had a whole bunch of organizations and the Jewish Agenda, etc. We could fit everybody into a meeting room of Anshe Chesed, the synagogue. And once it was off the TV screens, you couldn't get Jews to talk about it again. Now here we are in JVP, wonderful JVP. We have so many people just in the New York chapter. We have so many people all over the country. We have Students for Justice in Palestine. The movement has just grown immensely. Now, that's the contradiction. Unfortunately, the successes and growth of the movement is the result of the fact that the situation that the movement is about festers and gets more and more terrifying. So now I've forgotten your question.
I mean, I think I think so the question is, like, given the movement now, what do you struggle with? But I think what you're kind of getting at, and what we talked about kind of in our own conversations prior to this, is thinking about, like, what do you do about the fact that grief is what radicalizes us? And, like, that the movement has only been made stronger through so many losses that change people's minds.
I don't know. You know, people get radicalized because of their oppression, or their relationship to people who are oppressed. That's what makes people radical. Otherwise, you want to fit in and join the party, but not that party. I don't think I have an answer for that. But I want to go back to the question you asked me before, and that is, what do I struggle with now? What I struggle with is trying to conceptualize a policy, a practice that would integrate feminism and anti-militarism. Because, you know, I can talk about it as an intellectual thing, and we in JVP are dedicated to intersectionality, but we don't really do intersectionality about women. And I would like us to find a way to do that. And we don't really do intersectionality about militarism besides, you know, like the deadly exchange and opposition to U.S. military funding of Israel's killing machines. They're all killing machines. And they're, I think, more than half of the U.S. budget. That's what our taxes are buying. So I don't know how to do this, but I would like to have people join me in trying to think about how we could make that part of what we do.
Yeah. I just want to highlight something that Raza is saying about how relationships are key, and how you, Sherry, have shown this through kind of all the people that you brought up, and became passionate about kind of through what they witnessed.
I didn't hear the last words.
Oh, that you became passionate about certain issues because of kind of what they witnessed, and kind of saw through their eyes. That relationships have always been key in this.
Yes.
So we are nearing towards 5:30. And I want to kind of respect other people's time, but I also know that we had a little bit of tech issues. I also want you to know, Sherry, because you said you didn't want to multitask, that people are showing a lot of love in the chat, and are so interested in your life, and so grateful that you shared it with us, and shared your passions and work with us. We are gonna kind of close on time, and I guess I'll just close up by saying thank you to everyone for coming to this. Thank you to Sherry. We're so grateful for you. Claps that you can't see nor totally hear, but they're happening.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. I mean, it means a lot to me. And it's very generous of those who have worked on this, making this possible. And it's very generous of the rest of you for spending your time listening to me talk about myself. So I really appreciate it. And I'm so happy to be connected with all of you.